progressives, I'll quote intellectuals and race, broadly speaking, while in the progressive era, socioeconomic differences were attributed to race, in the liberal era, such differences were often attributed to racism. Let's take each in turn, the progressives and the liberals. The progressives, of course, dominated the first several decades of the last century. Who were they? And broadly speaking, what did they believe about race?
They believed that differences in performances and outcomes between races were due to genetics. And therefore, that they also believed in things like eugenics. And they set the stage for what ultimately became the Holocaust.
And why did they call themselves progressives? Or why did they come to be called progressives?
Well, I guess they seem to think that they alone were interested in progress. But of course, everybody believes in some changes, and they believe that those changes will be for the better. So it's hard for me to understand how they could distinguish themselves from others by that term. But they believe they could, and I guess that's what matters.
All right. You quote H.L. Mencken, whom you call a prominent intellectual during the progressive era. Quote, "It is apparent that the Negro, no matter how much he is educated, must remain, as a race, in a condition of subservience, that he must remain the inferior. Therefore, the effort to educate him has awakened in his mind ambitions and aspirations which, in the very nature of things, must go unrealized." Close quote. It's that phrase, in the very nature of things,
yes,
that gets to the view.
Yes, that was a pervasive view during that era.
And it is straightforward, pure racism in the strict sense of believing that the races are materially different from one another.
Yes. It's sort of hard to... One of the problems with this way of thinking is that it eternalizes a set of circumstances that exist at the moment. And when you realize how even a whole century is just a blink of an eye in the history of the human race, and when you realize, for example, that IQ tests have only existed for about a century and are by no means infallible, if you look back over the centuries and you see how the races that were on top at one time were now no longer on top. I mean, at one time, the Middle East was the leading civilization in the world. And before them, China, for even more centuries, was the leading civilization in the world. And even within Europe, it was precisely the Southern Europeans who were so much more advanced than the people in Britain or Scandinavia back in the days of
Greece and Rome.
Greece and Rome. But what the people of that era did was take the different achievements of different groups and sort of freeze them in stone as if there was no past and there would be no future.
It's possible to dismiss Mencken. Mencken is one of the figures you mentioned here as a provocateur or a reactionary. But you note that his views were shared by John Maynard Keynes, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Woodrow Wilson, leading figures,
yes,
looked upon even today as leading intellectuals of the first years of the 20th century. They weren't bad or malevolent people.
No.
Talk for a moment or two, because they based, as best I can tell from the book, the IQ tests. They believed that they actually had objective evidence. They had proof of the differences between races arising from these intelligence tests that began to be given around the time of the First World War.
Yes.
Where do these tests come from?
Well, different places, some from Stanford, Terman, for example. But one of the people, Brigham, who was the author of the College Board Scholastic Aptitude Test, made the argument that these tests disproved the idea that Jews were very intelligent because they scored low on the Army mental test in the First World War. And now 7 years later, he finally comes out and says, that admits that his conclusion was without foundation because many of the immigrants who took that test were raised in homes where people didn't speak English. They didn't look into the data on blacks, my gosh, the amount of education that blacks had at that time was pathetic, and the quality was even worse. So one of the ironies that I found in going through these things in detail was that if you look at the Army tests that blacks did much worse on very easy questions that required a knowledge of words than on much more difficult questions that did not. And so, for example, the questions were, tell which of the following are opposites. And they had things like black and white, night and day, up and down. And blacks got wiped out on those tests. And the reason is that how many of them knew what the word opposite meant at that point?
Right.
But the other tests, for example, required you to look at pictures of stacks of blocks, including some blocks you couldn't see, but which you had to infer from the shape of the stack and count them. And blacks didn't do nearly as badly on those tests.
Got it. You also note that certain cultural groups scored especially low on abstract reasoning. It's not just African Americans. It's also Gaelic speakers in the Scottish Hebrides. It's Indians in South Africa. It's working class children in rural England. It's lower class youngsters in Venezuela. It's a particular culture that is perhaps too poor to have the time, as it were, or the intellectual resources to devote to abstract reasoning.
I would look at it somewhat differently.
You would?
I would say that very often we try to explain, for example, why the Irish didn't do as well as the English. And the real question is, well, the real fact is that the Irish were much more typical of people around the world than were the English. And the real question is, why did the English do so much better?
Why was there an industrial revolution on one island and not on the other?
That's right. And I think the same thing here, that if you go far enough back in history, I suspect you'll find that most of the human race had no interest in abstractions. And so the question becomes, certain kinds of cultures do have a desire for get into abstractions, and that becomes an enormous advantage to them. But I wouldn't try to explain why the others didn't do it, because the others were unfortunately what the majority of people are like in the world, even today.
All right. Liberals, intellectuals, and race. If minorities were seen as the problem during the Progressive era, the majority was seen as the problem during the liberal era that began after the Second World War. The central premise of liberal intellectuals for decades was that the racial problem was essentially inside the minds of white people. Explain that, Tom.
Well, what Gunnar Myrdal, who did the classic study on this, said was that you didn't even have to look at what blacks did. You could only look at what the whites were thinking. And this suggests that that these random thoughts from nowhere were the reason for the problems. The problem was that different groups of people have been different in substance all around the world and for centuries, and that blacks and whites in the United States are no exception to that. And it's very hard to have a society where people with very different cultures coexist.
Tom, you quote in Intellectuals and Race the famous black writer James Baldwin. He's writing in 1960, quote, "People in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else. In a new housing project in Harlem, they naturally began smashing windows, defacing walls, and, you'll forgive me, but this is his language, urinating in the elevators." Close quote. What's wrong with his thinking?
Oh my gosh, you'd need a couple of hours. But it so happens I grew up in Harlem in the 1940s, 1950s, and you didn't expect to find people urinating in places where black people lived. In fact, there's very little attention given to the fact that the public housing of that era was radically different from the public housing of today. I remember we had a relative of ours got into some public housing. We were so proud because you had to have a certain character, a record, and so forth to get in. These were not places where you had dumping grounds for people who were at the bottom of the pile.
There was no less discrimination in the 40s and 50s in the minds of white people toward black people
That's
when
right.
you were growing up in Harlem.
That's right.
And yet Harlem, I was just thinking about this the other day, that great Duke Ellington classic, Take the A Train.
Yeah.
The A Train was and remains, as far as I know, the subway train up the west side of Manhattan.
Yes.
It's what white people used to get to Harlem. Harlem
Yeah.
was an attractive place. It was a place of culture and
Yeah.
excitement. So what was it then, if it wasn't in the minds of white people, what took place in Harlem in the 60s?
I think the 60s was a period of general irrationality, and wherever there's irrationality, there are people who know how to turn that irrationality to their benefit. And you began to get some very opportunistic leaders who then began to say things that they knew to be false, but which they knew would advance their careers.
Now, let me quote Intellectuals and Race one more time. Among the differences between the two eras, that is to say, the time you grew up in Harlem and the 60s, was that the intelligentsia, both black and white, became more prone in the later period to make excuses for moral squalor and barbaric behavior. Your words here. Mm-hmm. After such notions permeated the society, barbaric behavior and moral squalor became accepted norms within some segments, close quote. So you are not merely making the argument, I'm asking, that the liberal view that what was in their minds dictated the behavior of African Americans. That you're not merely making the view that liberals were mistaken. You're making the view that you're making the argument that they were culpable.
Yes. And as I point out at a few places in the book, you can go to England and see the very same pattern emerging, including this pattern where kids in school who are trying to do well get beaten up by other kids. Theodore Dalrymple is a doctor in Britain, and he writes about the kids who have to go to the hospital. They're so badly beaten up simply because they're doing well in school, and these are white kids, lower class in Britain. So you see the very same pattern, and all the things that are supposed to explain that pattern and explain it away among blacks are found among people who have none of those same factors. But what's the same in both places is that the intellectuals have told them that the world is unjust, that other people are keeping them down, that the fact that they don't have what other people have is somebody else's fault. And if you buy that vision, then of course there's no reason for you to do well in school, and you resent those who do well because they've bought into the enemy's way of thinking.